What to the slave is the 4th of July? Asked Frederick Douglass in an 1852 speech to the Anti-Slavery Sewing Society of Rochester, New York. This question framed his speech, which is perhaps the most famous of his career and possibly is considered the best anti-slavery speech ever given. His answer, as I'll discuss in this talk today, embodied some of the most fundamental constitutional conundrums of the antebellum United States. At the time he gave this speech, Douglass was one of the most well-known Americans of the era, receiving invitations to speak from communities across the North. But the speech he gave in the place where he lived with his wife and children, and where he had just founded his own anti-slavery newspaper, the North Star. The question Douglass posed was one that approached the celebration of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in a new light. So what did this storied document that many Americans consider to signal the birth of a new nation based on liberty and equality mean to the people that it enslaved by law? As white Americans enjoyed picnics and parades, what did this symbol of American national pride mean to people who lived within the nation's borders and yet were still excluded from enjoying the fruits of their labors? I want to focus on this speech today because it gives us a glimpse into what were key constitutional debates of the years before the Civil War. Was the Constitution a pro-slavery document? Was it an anti-slavery document? And what could be made of a document that established freedom for so many people while referring obliquely to the ownership of and trade in many others? Douglass was able to articulate the conflict between freedom and slavery in 19th century America better than most others. He was, after all, born into slavery in Maryland sometime around the year 1818. He never knew for sure. For those of you who've read his autobiography, that's how it begins, talking about how he doesn't know his birthday, but historians think that it was probably around 1818. And as a young man, he lived and worked in both the city and country, where his experiences revealed the paradoxes of American slavery. Though he was considered chattel property, so a thing, his mistress taught him to read at a young age. And he was rented out as a wage worker at Baltimore shipyards as an adolescent, where his master allowed him to keep some of the wages he earned. This later helped him in his escape. At the same time, these privileges did not spare him from the whip or from the wrath of a cruel overseer while working as a field hand on Maryland's eastern shore. The scars he bore from his time as a field hand made him into a symbol of the horrors of slavery as he witnessed to Northern audiences later in life. He'd often take off his shirt and show them the scars for people who thought he was too articulate to have been a slave. Douglass escaped from slavery in 1838 via both the Underground Railroad and the actual railroad. His skills in reading and writing allowed him to forge a pass that kept him disguised as a sailor on the train that took him out of Baltimore. This passing as either a free person or as someone else was something that a lot of slaves did. After arriving in New York, Douglass was brought into the community of runaway slaves and freed African Americans who lived there. He later wrote his autobiography, published in 1845, which was one of 3 autobiographies he wrote during his lifetime. It was a bestseller that made him famous across the United States. He made his living as an orator, receiving sponsorship from abolitionists. So what did the 4th of July mean to slaves? Douglass opened his speech by remarking on the meaning of the day. It was, he said, the 76th birthday of the nation's founding, an age that would be advanced for a man, though not too advanced, but young for a nation. One might expect that Douglass might lament this fact. 76 years was a long time for a nation based on freedom to support and perpetuate the institution of slavery. But rather than dwell on this, Douglass explained his feelings differently. He was glad, he said, that the nation was so young. Quote, "The eye of the reformer is met with angry flashes portending disastrous times. But his heart may well beat lighter at the thought that America is young and that she still is in the impressionable stage of her existence. May he not hope that the high lessons of wisdom, of justice, of truth will yet give direction to her destiny?" Talking about the nation as kind of a child, right? She'll learn as she grows old, becomes wise. Douglass's references to angry flashes that portend disastrous times referred to the political context in which he spoke. So the nation was just recovering from the Mexican-American War, which ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. While the war was a victory for the nation, it was considered a disaster for those who advocated the abolition of slavery. With the treaty, the United States acquired not only Texas, but the entirety of what today is considered the nation's Southwest, including California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, and our lovely Panhandle. This was a lot of land. So why did this war, little remembered in popular history, aside from the directive to remember the Alamo, which, do we always remember what we're supposed to remember at the Alamo? I'm not sure. But so why did this so enrage people who opposed slavery? In short, the annexation of so much land meant new territories and new states would be organized. And Southern slave owners delighted in this fact, hoping the event would result in the creation of new slave states. So anyone familiar with mid-19th century political history, which I'm assuming is most of my audience, will remember that the balance of slave and free states in the Union was tremendously important to those on both sides of the issue. Northern states, with their large populations, dominated the House of Republicans. With a northern majority in the Senate, those states might collude to pass laws or constitutional amendments that abolished slavery throughout the nation, as they had already done in their own states. By the 1840s, the Southerners were running out of land that they could claim for new slave states to keep up with the new free states being organized in the territory claimed by the Louisiana Purchase. And part of this was based on the Missouri Compromise, that line that ran west. The Mexican-American War and the annexation of so much land provided a perfect opportunity to continue the spread of slavery west, cementing its existence for years, possibly centuries to come. The war embroiled American politics and led to the disintegration of the old two-party system that was dominated by Whigs and Jacksonian Democrats. When Douglass spoke in 1852, he spoke in the middle of a new party realignment, one that would eventually coalesce into the establishment of the new Republican Party in 1854. He also spoke at a moment when American slavery seemed more entrenched than ever. Congress had recently passed a new Fugitive Slave Act, which required bystanders to apprehend fugitive slaves, even in free states. This outraged even those who were apathetic about the existence of slavery in the South, as it seemed to make them accomplices in the practice of human bondage, regardless of what their consciences dictated. But Douglass spoke only tangentially about the current political turmoil and chose to instead emphasize the conditions that led to the American Revolution, in turn drawing a parallel to the present day. He termed the Declaration of Independence the crux of the American nation, calling it the very ringbolt in the chain of America's yet undeveloped destiny. Again, this sense that the nation's not quite fulfilled its promise. And here Douglass made an important move in his rhetoric. By glorifying the Declaration of Independence, he called Americans to return to it and to its true spirit. But he also alludes to the idea that it has not practiced what it preaches in that founding declaration. Quote, "The principles contained in that instrument are saving principles. Stand by those principles, be true to them in all occasions, in all places, against all foes, and at whatever cost." There seems to be accordingly a struggle over the spirit of the document itself. Douglass saw the slavery issue as the one in which America would either prove itself a truly democratic nation or fail in upholding its most basic governing principles. By elevating the founding principles enshrined in the Declaration, Douglass began his speech with a message of hope, the hope that the United States could one day vindicate the principles therein. He encouraged the crowd to cling to this day, cling to it and to its principles, with the grasp of a storm-tossed mariner to a spar at midnight. Those are his words, not mine. It was this exhortation to remember the principles embodied by the founding that Douglass next turned to slavery in his talk, a much darker subject, obviously, than the celebrations marking the 4th of July. But by beginning with praise for the founders and for their ideas, Douglass made an important move. He compared the struggle for American freedom against British oppression to the one that American slaves and their abolitionist allies faced in the current moment. As the founders struggled mightily, losing lives in battles over great principles, so too might the nation require another fight for freedom, with this one challenging the despotism within the nation itself. In some ways, he's presaging the Civil War here. Douglass did not mince words in pointing out that the great contradictions inherent in a free people who held slaves. Throughout the first part of his speech, and this is really brilliant that he does this, because he doesn't call attention to it later, Douglass intentionally uses the second person, you. When he referred to the United States and its national greatness, it was something that they, his white audience, enjoyed. So he's celebrating it as something that they have. He carefully positioned himself on the outside, a man who was born and raised in the United States but still remained outside of the political community. He and other African American men like him, be they slave or free, labored and lived within a nation that they could not call their own. He emphasized his own exclusion from the celebrations marking independence, simultaneously appealing to the great legacy inherited by white Americans while underscoring the marginalization of African Americans. Douglass stated this plainly, quote, "The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. The 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in your joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony." End quote. The 4th of July is yours, not mine. This is the heart of Douglass's speech, the tremendous distance that existed within the nation between those who were slaves and those who were free. He could both celebrate the promise, but notice the irony. And even between men like himself who had freed themselves from slavery and yet still remained bereft of the benefits that liberty was meant to entail. On the day that white Americans celebrated their freedom, it brought into relief even more starkly the grievances of those who were not free. Quote, "Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilee shouts that reach them." So this day, more than any other, was a symbol of the ways in which the promises of the Declaration of Independence, of freedom and liberty, were exclusive ones, reserved for only a portion of Americans. The rest were not inheritors of this liberty. They were perhaps not even truly Americans. It was with this observation that Douglass introduced his most damning indictment of America yet. Quote, "I do not hesitate to declare with all my soul that the character and conduct of this nation never looked blacker to me than on the 4th of July. Whether we turn to the declarations of the past or to the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future." End quote. And so Douglass levied his call to Americans. There was nothing perplexing about American slavery. This problem, as he saw it, was a simple one with a simple solution. Everywhere across the nation, slaves proved themselves to be men. After all, slaves could be tried in court. They could learn to read and write, as he did. They could become ministers and marry for love and build a home and family if they were allowed to do so. In short, they were men. Not property, not things. American slavery rested on a fiction that reserved the natural rights of liberty and equality, those upon which the Declaration was based, and the American Revolution was justified, as only being bestowed by nature on some men and not all. With this argument, Douglass showed how empty those vaunted words of the founding had become. So what to the slave was the 4th of July? Douglass answered, "A day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity, your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery, your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages." With this searing condemnation of American politics and culture, one might assume that Douglass might have few kind words about the Constitution, which other abolitionists condemned as a pro-slavery document, for its inclusion of the 3/5 Compromise, a fugitive slave clause, and reference to the international slave trade. Perhaps most famously, William Lloyd Garrison burned a copy of the Constitution on the steps of the Massachusetts State House just 2 years later, declaring it a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. But Douglass held a different view. He interpreted the Constitution as an anti-slavery document, arguing that it was those who supported slavery that had twisted its meaning and perverted its interpretation. The Constitution belonged to those who believed in the freedom of all men, and in the promise that men like Frederick Douglass could be brought from the margins into the American people. This distinction is really important. Men like William Lloyd Garrison, in rejecting the Constitution itself, rejected political solutions to slavery in favor of revolution. If the founding document of the nation was pro-slavery, then it would take nothing less than its overthrow and replacement to rid it of its original stain. Douglass's views, though, full of frustration, disappointment, and anger over the existence of slavery, endorsed the idea that a political solution could be found. Perhaps the United States could recover the virtues of the founding through a political solution. Perhaps a movement could emerge that would vindicate the promises of the Declaration of Independence. Despite his fiery rhetoric, Douglass's vision remained hopeful for the future. The state of affairs was dark, but not all was lost. America could still make good on its promise. Douglass lived to see the Civil War. Indeed, he was instrumental in recruiting black soldiers for the famous 54 Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, the one from the movie Glory. And we can see how these key ideas were when the nation was in the midst of war. Lincoln, in the Gettysburg Address, and in many of his speeches really echoes Douglass, referred to the Civil War as a new birth of freedom, implying that the nation was in the midst of a battle over its soul. Despite his condemnation of the nation's practices and his exclusion from the vaunted blessings of liberty, Douglass advocated for a vision of a better and freer nation. And despite his belief in a political solution, it would take a war to accomplish. Thank you.
Freedom 101 is made possible by generous support from the University of Oklahoma Alumni Association. Freedom 101 is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.